Of all the charges facing Mr. Trump, this is the one that's on the most thin legal ground. Even Republicans who oppose Trump have said that they find this a rather flimsy prosecution, although we have to wait and see because the indictment, as we're speaking, is sealed.
President Trump has now been indicted. His lawyer says that Mr. Trump was informed of the indictment late today. Many legal analysts said that such an indictment on what is really a relatively small legal matter is going to be a tough case to prosecute. But otherwise, observers are saying the prosecutor wanted an indictment, perhaps not so much to prosecute, but to press on Donald Trump while he's running for office again. Joining us, the veteran political reporter David Drucker. David, thanks for being with us tonight. So Trump and his team has said that an indictment might actually help his presidential run, but he put out a statement saying that this is pure political persecution. You've written a book about the 24 contenders. What do you think?
Well, it's a really good question, Rob, and I think it's important that we don't jump to conclusions. One of the things I have learned about covering campaign politics, particularly in the Trump era, is we may think things are one way one day, and then we find out a few days down the road that it's a lot different than we thought it would turn out. There are going to be a lot of snap polls next week. I'm not really interested in those. I'm interested in the polls the week after that, after some of the dust has settled, such that it can with a matter like this. Look, there's a possibility that this helps Trump in the short term, in that it keeps him front and center in the news. He's dominating the Republican primary, not just because of who he is and who so far his official opponents are, not his unofficial opponents, but his official opponents. But also now this is a matter that's going to be discussed ad nauseum on news programs across the country every single day and all over social media. So it could help him in that regard. But I'd caution against reading too much into how this helps Trump. He already has a firm grasp on a good 25 to 30%, 35% of the Republican base, depending on which state we're talking about at any given time. So that's just a given, and that's a strength in this campaign. But if we look back to last summer, prior to the midterm elections, when the FBI executed a search warrant at Mar-a-Lago, there was a lot of talk that this was going to energize Republicans. It was going to remind Republicans who were ready to move past Trump why they liked him. They were going to feel like he was being politically persecuted, to use that term, and they were going to rally to his side, and Republicans were on their way to a landslide midterm sweep in November, and it just didn't work out that way. It was very damaging to the party. It was very damaging in many respects, at least at that point, to Mr. Trump, who emerged from the midterm elections trailing in polls to Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and showing more weakness than he had in the previous 6.5, 7, 8 years or so. And so I don't know that this helps him long term, because it reminds voters that even if they think he is being persecuted, even if they believe that he's being treated unfairly, they might just be exhausted by everything and wonder if it's time to move on, even if they don't blame him for it. And there are a lot more voters that would like to see a new Republican atop the party, or at least there are more than there are voters who want another 4 years of Mr. Trump in the White House.
You know, word was that the grand jury was going to not reconvene on this until weeks from now, and that an indictment, if it were to happen, was not going to be till maybe even the end of April, and then today's bombshell. Are you surprised that there was an indictment and that it happened so soon?
Well, I don't know if I'm surprised or not. I mean, like everybody else, I was following the news. At first, it seemed like it was imminent, and then all of a sudden it wasn't. And, this is just a pattern with Trump. You think something's going to happen, then it doesn't. Something's not supposed to happen. Something is supposed to happen, then it doesn't happen, and vice versa. I get all turned around by it. I think we were just looking at what we were hearing from the New York District Attorney, looking at what we were hearing, listening to what Trump was saying a couple of weeks ago. So, I think the larger question here is, as we've talked about, as legal analysts have said, of all the charges facing Mr. Trump, this is the one that's on the most thin legal ground. Even Republicans who oppose Trump have said that they find this a rather flimsy prosecution, although we have to wait and see because the indictment, as we're speaking, is sealed. So we don't entirely understand everything about it. But there's a case in Georgia related to Mr. Trump's attempt to overturn the election in Georgia in 2020. Obviously, the special counsel under the Department of Justice purview is investigating his role in attempting to overturn the results of the 2020 election as it relates to January 6, 2021. Those could be a lot more legally perilous for Donald Trump than this case could. So I guess in some sense, if you're looking at the menu of options for prosecuting Mr. Trump, this would seem the least likely where you'd expect a prosecutor to forge ahead. But on the other hand, as I've said before, Mr. Bragg has voters too, and his voters in Manhattan in the 5 boroughs generally oppose Mr. Trump, think he should be indicted for a whole host of things. And I suspect voters in New York City are happy to see him indicted for something, even if they were to say, well, yeah, it may be political, or I don't know if this is entirely fair, but it's probably fair because he just deserves it anyway. And Mr. Bragg, just like a lot of politicians, is probably thinking about his voters the same way Trump did as president and the way, other politicians do in office.
But aside from deep blue New York City, where they might very well be happy politically, there were a lot of Democratic voices around the country who are saying maybe it isn't a good idea on this count, on this case.
That's correct. And I think there are some Democrats that are concerned that this strengthens Donald Trump's hold on the Republican Party. I think they worry that it makes it harder to go after him on some other cases. I think some people would just like him to recede from the headlines, and you can't recede from the headlines when you get indicted and you're the first former president to be indicted. And so there are legal concerns that, as we've discussed, Rob, there are lots of lawyers and legal analysts who oppose Donald Trump, don't want to see him elected president again, didn't want to see him elected president in the first place, who look at this from a legal perspective and, wonder if an indictment is warranted. But I think it's just important to point out that there are all sorts of political crosscurrents here, not just those that have to do with how Republicans feel about Trump's indictment.
America is hoping for some calm, some normalcy after everything we've been through. And, there are bonfires in this country today, but this is going to be a political and legal inferno that we're going to go through with a former president being indicted.
Correct. And I think, that's going to concern some people. Look, I think whatever side of the aisle you are on when it comes to Donald Trump, and you don't even have to be on an aisle, on a left or right side of the aisle. There are disagreements about Trump on the left and the right to varying degrees. You can just want the whole thing to be over. And there is a sense of exhaustion. I think it's one of the reasons why President Biden won in 2020. I think it's one of the reasons why Democrats did so well in the 2022 midterm elections. There's just this exhaustion with things related to Donald Trump. And I suspect that even a lot of voters that might, in some sense, feel like this is karma come home to roost for Trump, but maybe they'd like to see it happen in a different way just because they'd like to turn on the television for once and not have to hear his name. And I know from talking to voters that is the case, both for people who are strong supporters of Trump and people who are strong opponents of Trump.
Do you think influences around President Biden and the Democratic Party were pushing this in some way, shape, or form?
Well, you never know who's doing what, but I don't actually think that this is the sort of thing where Alvin Bragg's phone was ringing off the hook saying, listen, you got to get him. You've got a case in Georgia that is on much firmer legal ground. If there's an indictment there, you have an investigation, a federal investigation by special counsel Jack Smith, a much bigger deal for Democrats concerned about Trump and his impact on the country. And I just don't know that they were going to put all their eggs into the New York District Attorney's basket here with this case.
David, we are looking at history and monumental history when this indictment is unsealed. So thank you for coming on tonight. As this unfolds, we'll have you back too.
Anytime. Thank you.